have with us today Professor Cremers. He's here from the Technical University of Munich. His background sort of originally came from mathematics and theoretical physics, and then moved into the field of computer vision after doing a postdoc here in California at UCLA. So he's been one of the top 40 researchers below 40. So on the merit of that credential and many others I won't repeat to you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Cremers.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome everyone to my presentation. There's still some seats up in front. This is work that's been done predominantly by, as always in research, and all of you know this, the work that professors tend to present is mostly work that their students actually did. And so it is here as well. So there's a number of my students that have been working on this, students and former postdocs, in particular Anna Maria, Thomas Yevgeny, Thomas Popp, and Bastian, two former postdocs of mine. And Antonin Chambol is from Paris, is an external collaborator who's been working with us for a couple of years now. What we're working on is computer vision, and just to give you an overview of some of the things we do, this is actually the whole lab. So there's about around 12 to 15 PhD students. There's 2 postdocs currently, and we're working on diverse topics in the area of image processing, computer vision, and more going in direction of optimization. Some of the things we do, this is not just vision, but it's in some sense robotics. It's autonomous navigation of quadrocopters. What you see here is a little quadrocopter. It only costs like $300, so you can easily buy it yourself. And it has a camera, and this is the front-facing camera, and using this camera, we are able to navigate this thing autonomously. So in real time, it can use the image data to localize itself and then to fly certain trajectories that we redefine, and then we can land again. Here's more examples where we tell the system just to stay in one location in space. So if ever you come by Munich anytime, do let me know. Come by our offices and we're happy to demo this system to you. It's very popular. People like to interact with it, so you can push it around, move it in all sorts of directions, and fool it by pushing it away, and it will always come back to the known location. So this is a system that uses predominantly the camera, but some other onboard sensors like inertial sensors to localize itself. So even if you cover the camera, the thing can still recover and get back. And even if you, slam it into the wall, like here, it collides with the wall, still it recovers and flies back. So this is kind of a system that uses predominantly vision to localize itself in space, to navigate around. You can do more once you have autonomous quadrocopters. This is another quadrocopter, actually one that was built in Munich by the company Ascending Technology, which was founded at TU Munich. These are the quadrocopters that I think most research labs nowadays are using. And here, this is an autonomous flying quadrocopter which recovers the geometry of the world. There is a little Kinect camera or ASUS sensor on top that measures distances from the world. And then you can use that. Here's a visualization of what we do is we develop algorithms which localize the quadrocopter in space. And this is a visualization of what the quadrocopter sees from, say, a third-person perspective. And once we have all this data that is acquired through the camera, we can fuse it in a 3D model, and this works in real time, so while the thing is flying, it can generate a dense map of its environment. This is some of the things you can do with computer vision, with cameras. I think they're quite useful to acquire data. In fact, in many ways more useful than, say, more traditional lasers can have, because the cameras are fast, they give a lot of information, and they're fairly cheap and lightweight. One of the classical problems in this area of computer vision is the reconstruction of geometry from images. And problem that you're all familiar with. You walk around some object, you see the object from different viewpoints, and what you want is you want to recover the geometry of what you're doing. There's more seats here. The way this problem and other problems have been solved in computer vision, and this has become the dominating paradigm today, is by minimizing energies or maximizing some optimality criterion. So optimization has become kind of the standard paradigm to solve this problem. Just to give you some examples, and this has emerged as the standard technique, I would say, in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So very much it goes back to the beginnings of image analysis. Image segmentation, there's many famous papers, the Gieman paper, and simulated annealing, the Blake Zisserman, the Snakes paper, the Manfred-Schachter, and many other papers. They all solve the segmentation problems of partitioning the image plane into meaningful regions. They solve it by setting up a cost function and then saying, find the configuration of minimal cost. Similarly, 3D reconstruction from multiple views has been formalized as an optimization problem, and actually some of the pioneering first optimization problems in computer vision were developed for optical flow estimation. In particular, the work of Horn and Chung is the first so-called variational method in computer vision. So it goes back to the early 80s here. And these are just a few representative works, and there's easily thousands more. But these are some of the most, I would say, influential ones. And what's interesting is that what all these approaches have in common is that they're minimizing non-convex images. So each of the references I mentioned, all these famous papers, they all set up cost functions that are not actually convex. And what that means is that you cannot easily find the optimum. Let's say you have your solution space, a 2D space in this kind of schematic drawing. You have some cost function defined on that space, and then you say, find the configuration of lowest cost. Of course, if your solution space has 2 dimensions, that's great. Then you can just discretize the space and search for the best solution. Try all solutions, and if you can try that fairly efficiently, you can discretize fairly finely, and you will find the best solution on that discretization. Unfortunately, this is not going to work in higher dimensions. If you have 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, it may still work. But a lot of the problems we are looking at are very high dimension. For example, the problem of geometric reconstruction is really a problem of infinite dimensions. The way you can easily see that is, let's say I give you a guess of the geometry. I say, how about the sphere? Is the object I'm reconstructing a sphere? Maybe it's not. Maybe you want to change the sphere to make it match the data better. How can you modify a sphere? You can modify it at all points of the surface. You can, make protrusions or indentations, and so perturb the sphere at infinitely many points. And these are all independent degrees of freedom to your problem. And this is how you can even intuitively see that geometric reconstruction is a problem of infinite dimensions. Or in other words, I cannot possibly try all possible 3D reconstructions and see which one is the best. There's just not enough time. A different way to kind of pin that down is if you, let's say, you discretize space into lots of little voxels. Each voxel can be object or background. You don't know beforehand. So you have very many possible configurations of reconstructions. Each voxel can be object background. If we have large n voxels, then we have 2 to the power of n possible reconstructions on that discrete group. And if n is 300 cubed, there's a near infinite human reconstructions. And you cannot try them all, not in a day, not in a week, not in a year, not in a month. So we have to go in a different way, and of course, the key is to move towards convex energies, because convex energies is a class of energies which you can typically minimize efficiently even in very high dimensions. So even if you have more than 2 dimensions, you can, the most naive way to minimize them is you start somewhere and you just go downhill. And at each point you can determine locally what is the steepest descent direction, keep going until it doesn't go down further, and once it no longer goes down any further, you're at the global minimum, if you have convexity. So this is obvious. I mean, in the optimization literature, everyone knows convex energies are better than non-convex energies. But the question is, how do you get from the non-convex energies to the convex ones? And I argue that a lot of the classical approaches are potentially useless if you don't have a way to compute minimizers. Let's say someone gives you an energy and says, the solution is the minimum of this energy. How you compute it, I don't know. Does it help you to solve the problem? Not really. And often what people did is local minimization. So they started somewhere and went downhill, the way I said. If you initialize appropriately, and that's what's usually written in the papers, then you find the right solution, but who knows? And this is the problem that most students face when they have to re-implement these approaches. At some point in the paper it says, and here we initialize appropriately. Maybe you've read that at some point in your career. And then you've wondered, what exactly does that mean, appropriately? It usually means there is a user in the loop, and he has some idea of what is the machine. And that implies that these methods will not work in a fully automatic manner when we don't have the user in the loop. So I would argue that in order to get anything that is really automatic, that does not require an informed user to tell us, I think it's probably something like this. In order to get the fully automatic solution, we have to move towards convex energies. And this has been done. There's a lot of related work. These are some of the papers that inspired us and me most. And a lot of them are from the applied math community. For example, this one of Alberti, Buscetta, and Dalmaso is the Italian School of Applied Mathematics. And this was a lot of inspiration to what I'm presenting now. What I wanted to talk about now is 4 application areas in computer vision. One is the problem I started with, 3D reconstruction from images. Then the so-called stereo problem is a particular case where you only have 2 images and you want to recover depths or disparity in that. Then segmentation, a classical problem in vision. And lastly, the problem of 3D shape matching. These are all arranged by application areas, but what's really behind each of these applications is a specific class of energies or cost functions, and the question of how to connexify this class of functions. Meaning I'll be talking about these applications, but the class of energies that we are able to minimize in each of these problems generalizes to many other applications. So let's talk about multi-view reconstruction. There's tons of ways to get geometry from images. Yes?
Are you taking questions with the hand, or?
Go ahead.
Sure. So, because it's, I would say, we could all agree that it's harder to formulate convex energies than non-convex energies. Like, if you just pick any old random function that you think is intuitive, then yeah. So, there's a trade-off. There's like an implicit trade-off between like the richness of your model, the stuff that you're capturing in your energy function, and if it's more rich, then it's maybe less likely to be convex. So couldn't it be the case that you have a non-convex energy function that is like richer and sort of captures more of what that user in the loop would want, rather than a rather than a convex energy where you can find the global optimum, but because it's less rich of a model, it doesn't capture as much as you want? Can you comment on that?
Yes. So this is, of course, a very broad topic that we could speak about for days. I'd say there is a trade-off about what you want to minimize and what you can minimize.
Mm-hmm.
But my argument is, what's the interest in what you want to minimize if you cannot minimize it? Right? That's the issue. I mean, at some point you have to compute things. And if you have no way of computing the minimizing, what's the use? So it's interesting to first formalize what you would like to minimize, but then the question comes of, can you minimize it and how? And So what I will show here is that a lot of actually the classes of problems that people have proposed, we can convexify. And we can then, for the same energy, compute solutions that are either optimal or at least within a bound of the optimal. And that way you combine the two, and this is, in my view, the ideal thing. So, and so what you want is, you want to have the intersection of what you like to compute and what can be computed. So it's a very, very good idea. So 3D reconstruction from images, many ways to get geometry from images. The most prominent way is that of stereo photo consistency. And for those who don't work in computer vision, I'll briefly sketch the idea. It's actually quite simple. You have, say, a set of images, and for the moment we assume we know how they're oriented and how they're facing. So we know the calibration of each camera, basically. And then we can ask, is a voxel in this 3D space here, is it on the surface of the object, yes or no? And the simple idea is that if you take this voxel and project it into each image, if the voxel is on the surface, I should be seeing the same color in the two images. There are some assumptions that enter this approach. The main assumption being that the object is what's called Lambertian, meaning the observed brightness or color does not depend on the viewpoint. In practice, it means it shouldn't be too shiny. If something is shiny and you move around, the appearance changes depending on the viewpoint. So here we assume it's not too shiny. So we should be seeing the same color.
One quick question.
Yes,
Is that are you talking about the general or linear deformations?
in general. There's no linear assumption. So I project voxels into pairs of images. If I see the same color, the voxel is likely to be on the surface. If instead I look at another voxel project into images, I tend to see different colors because I'm not actually looking at the same structure. The other assumption, by the way, is obvious. We assume that the world is colored, that there is texture. And I argue if we as humans were living in a purely uniform colored white world, we wouldn't be seeing much with our eyes. So in some sense, the eyes, evolutionary adapted to a textured environment. So with that, we can, basically what we can do is we can assign to each voxel in that space, let's call it V, some value of a rho that is called the photo consistency. And in practice, it may take value, say, in an interval from 0 to 1. And 0 means, for this green point, it's very photoconsistent. We have a good color consistency in the projections. And 1 means we have a bad color consistency. And once we've computed this photoconsistency for all voxels, we can formalize the reconstruction problem simply by saying, find a surface S in that 3D space, such that if I integrate the photoconsistency over the entire surface, it should have a small value, meaning all points on the surface should be maximally photoconsistent. And that's been done for 3D reconstruction by Faugeras and Thierry. For segmentation, similar energies are known as the so-called geodesic active contours have been proposed in the numbers. Now if I ask you what is the optimal solution to this problem, anyone have an idea? It's actually quite easy to read off what the best surface is that minimizes this energy. Keep in mind the photoconsistency always takes on non-negative values. So there's always some really positive values that are summed for all points on the surface. How would I get the lowest possible energy? Anyone have a guess? Let's assume you take a very small surface. Then you accumulate very little photoconsistency. Right? And in the extreme case, if you take no surface at all, empty set, you get zero cost. And you clearly can't beat that. We don't even have to switch on the computer to solve this problem. We can read off the solution. And in fact, what this tells you is that there's something fishy about this image. And this is not uncommon, especially in the context of non-convex. This energy as a function of the surface is highly non-convex. In the context of non-convex energies, people have often overlooked this issue. If you go back to these papers and read about that, you don't typically find any discussion on this issue. Right? Someone says, I'm formalizing this problem as an energy minimization problem, i.e. the best solution is the one of lowest energy. Here is the best solution. Is it the one that I want? No, it's not. So clearly there's something missing. Of course, in later years this has been, observed, and it's often called the shrinking bias. So there is an issue with this energy. People have devised kind of heuristics to fix it. For example, they add some expansion force that favors larger volumes, etc. We try to study the problem and try to kind of correct it in the sense that we want to assure that the empty set does not arise as an optimal solution. And basically, of course, I mean, the intuition is quite clear. You walk around this object, you see an object in every image, and if the machine tells you there is nothing there, that can't be right. I see an object, there must be a way to impose that knowledge in the reconstruction. How do we do it? Well, we stick with the same optimization problem, this minimal weighted surface, if you will. It's the area of the surface weighted by the photoconsistency at any point of the surface. This is what we want to minimize, and now we impose constraints. The constraints say the projection of that surface into each image I, so I have n images from I to n, from 1 to n. The projection into each image should match the silhouette that I see. So I assume I see some compact object, I have a silhouette, and this should be consistent with the reconstruction. From a top view, this silhouette consistency actually has two kinds of constraints. If I boil it down to these visual rays, so this is the camera center, here's the top view, this is the image plane, here's the volume, here's my object. The two constraints are as follows. If any given pixel is inside the silhouette, as here, then the ray going through that pixel must intersect the object somewhere. I don't know where, but I know somewhere there must be an object. Whereas if the pixel is outside the silhouette, then I know the ray going through that pixel does not intersect the object anywhere. How can I now solve this optimization problem? It's a constrained optimization problem where I combine silhouette information and photoconsistency. What I didn't talk about is how you actually represent surfaces. There are many ways to represent surfaces. What we have found in terms of optimization is that the best representation is by indicator functions. Let's call this ray, by the way, I'll call it Rij, that is the ray through pixel j of image I. As I said, we represent the surface as an indicator function. That's a simple binary labeling. Each voxel in that space I label as 1 if it's object and 0 if it's background. You can easily see that in this manner I can represent any kind of surface. It doesn't have to be spherical topology, it can be a torus topology, anything you like. I can represent as a binary label. And once I rewrite this optimization problem as a function of this binary labeling U of the volume V, it looks like that. This looks a little bit complicated at first glance if you've not seen these kinds of problems before, but it's actually not so difficult. See, the function U labels the volume. It's 1 inside the object, 0 outside. So in the gradient, the derivative of U is actually 0 in most places of space, because it's constant inside the function U and it's constant outside. The gradient is non-zero only and exactly at the boundary of the object. In a way that if I integrate the gradient over the volume, then all that remains is the surface integral. And if I weight this gradient locally by the photoconsistency at all these voxels, then I get nothing but the integral of the photoconsistence. And in addition, the constraints, there are these two kinds of constraints. I said if the pixel is in the silhouette, then one of them must be on, at least one, maybe more, so the integral is at least one. Whereas if the pixel is outside the silhouette, then all of them must be zero, so the integral is zero. So these are the two constraints. And what's nice about this reformulation is, whereas this is highly non-convex as a function of S of the surface, this expression is convex. It's actually called the weighted total variation. It's easy to see that it's convex because the key is this is a linear operator, and then the norm is nothing but you know what the norm is like. It's a convex function, and if I weight it with positive weights and sum up in the integration, it preserves convexity. So it's clearly convex. And these constraints are linear, so that's simple. That's also convex in particular. The only thing that makes the problem non-convex is the binary constraint, because the set of binary functions is not a convex set. If I take two functions with binary values, unless they're the same, then say the weighted sum is no longer binary value. It takes intermediate values. And so what can we do to solve it? This is where the relaxation kicks in. We just neglect the constraint. We say, we don't care, let's drop the binary constraint, and what we do mathematically speaking is we replace the initial set by its convex output. That is functions that take values in the interval between 0 and 1. And so what that means intuitively is, instead of trying to find a hard labeling of space as object background, 1, 0, we allow soft labels in the interval. Loosely speaking, it's something like a probability that the voxel is object. That problem is now a convex problem, meaning the silhouette consistent configurations form a convex set, and that's perfect. Now I have a convex energy minimizing over a convex set, and the nice thing is here I can combine photoconsistency and silhouette consistency in a single convex optimization. And in particular, what I will get in these reconstructions are, in this approach, are reconstructions that are perfectly silhouette consistent by construction, because this is the constraint. We solve it. Of course, the problem is we drop the binarity constraint, so we get a real valued labeling. And what we do to get the hard labeling is we just threshold. We take some threshold value, and any u that is above the threshold we set to 1, any u that is below we set to 0. This is a heuristic, it's called thresholding, but for certain classes of problems it preserves optimality. Here, unfortunately, it does not. So we do not get a provably optimal solution in this manner, but we get a solution that is independent of initialization. So we don't need the user in the loop, and we can actually compute an optimality bound just by computing the energy of the relaxed problem and computing the energy of the thresholded solution, and the true solution is somewhere in between. Here are some of these solutions that we can compute. This is 3 out of about 20 or 30 images that you can download on the net, and these are the reconstructions that we do. So you can see we can preserve a lot of fine scale details here in this reconstruction, the hammer and the suit. They're not quite at the level of what you could get with laser scanners, but you should keep in mind this is camera-based, so I can easily run this on video as well. I can synchronize a set of 10 cameras and reconstruct actions over time, and this is something that is hard to do with laser scanners.
So I didn't quite catch the thing you were saying about the bound on the optimality of the relaxed problem.
So if you look at it in terms of energy, let's say you have look at it on an energy scale, let's say here you have the energy, then the lowest energy possible is the energy of the relaxed solution. Why? Because you are dropping a constraint in the optimization, so you're allowing more functions, so the energy you get is invariably the lowest possible. Then the true solution that you were hoping to get is the binary solution, the optimal binary solution. That is typically above the redux solution, because you only minimize over the set of binary functions. Once I threshold, I have a binary function. So I know this energy must be somewhere not right? So the thresholded, E thresholded is here, and these two I can compute, and so I know this is the solution I have, and I know how far the optimal is at most. This is called the gap. And so you can compute that and see how far. Here's more examples. This is a collaboration with a museum in Bonn. They wanted to virtualize these statues. They're a little more than human height. We walk around, we take pictures, and here are the reconstructions we can. And what's nice is there is no initialization. It's really black box. And you can see even for objects with different topology, if they have holes, etc., it doesn't matter. You can reconstruct. Here, I did mention you don't need to initialize. In practice, we can initialize. Here's an example. This is some pictures of a rabbit. We initialize somehow, and here you see the evolution of the approach to the optimal solution. The optimal solution, I should say, is not right for the approach near optimal solution. Now you see the geometric reconstruction we get here is okay. It's not terrific. Actually, my student will tell me there's a more recent version where he slightly improved the reconstruction. But this is good for what I want to present now. What you see is you get the reconstruction, but you don't have a lot of the fine scale fur structures. The eyes, etc., are not very deep. So one of the things we can ask ourselves to improve the visual appearance of the model we reconstructed is we can say, what's the color on the surface? Yes.
Is that just a limitation of the number of voxels that you're using to discretize in the size of the problem you're solving, or is it just inherent to the resolution of the cameras? Or both, some combination?
That's exactly the question I asked my student. Now assume you had implemented that and you got a great solution, and then your advisor comes by and says, what limits the resolution here?
Has he gotten back to you?
So, of course we want to push the limits, and then it's important to know where the limits are. To be honest, I don't know. My suspicion is there's multiple limitations. One is the resolution. This is 300 cube voxels. We maybe need more. The other may be the resolution of how accurately we can localize the cameras, the calibration. And then it may be an issue of how many pixels your images have. That may also be a limitation, the resolution of the input data. I think it's all three. And I think if you crank up, say if I take images of infinite resolution, so many megapixels or more, and if I calibrate the cameras more and more accurately and get higher and higher resolution, I don't see why there should be a limitation as to what you can do. And I don't see why it shouldn't be possible at some point to match the resolution of basic scales. But it's a good question. So let's look at the color problem. So for now, we assume that the surface is given. We have reconstructed the geometry S, and we have all the color images. II is RGB images, a set of RGB images. What we're looking for is the color on the surface. That is a mapping that tells us for each point on the surface an RGB value. Red, green, blue for each point on the surface. How do we do that? Well, if you come from optimization and variational methods like I do, you set up a variational function. You know, this would be the naive way of doing it, that makes, for me, most straightforward way. Interestingly, no one had done that before in this case. Why that is, I don't know. What people typically did, maybe to tell you, is they back project each texture onto the object. And then the problem is that these back projections don't coincide. There's some kind of minor alignment errors possibly, and so the colors they tell you for a surface point are not exactly the same. And And then the question is, what do you do? There are two strategies. One is that you just do a weighted average of all the back projections. And in image analysis, that's usually a bad idea. That's a common approach, but what it creates is a strong blurring. You know, if you have multiple data sources that don't agree, just taking the average is usually not a good strategy. You lose details, it blurs things. So what people devise then instead is they back project individual textures, and then they try to just back project for each point, find just one back projection and use that. But since there's not a single texture that sees the whole object, you have to model the transitions, which is called stitching, a separate optimization problem. When on the surface do I move from one back projection to the other? A very nasty kind of separate optimization problem. Here instead we go differently. We just set up a single energy, and this looks a little complicated, but again, you know, for those who are not working on variational methods, all these approaches have typically the same structure. There's a so-called data term that measures the consistency with the observations, and a regularity term that imposes some kind of regularity of the combination. The regularizer, to start with this one, is what's called, as I mentioned, the total variation. So it imposes that the color should not change too much once I move along the surface. And so this is the gradient with respect to the surface. The first term is the data term, and what that models is it actually models the image formation process. So note, I'm not saying the texture should match the observed colors. I'm saying once I blur and downsample the texture, then it should match the observations. So I'm actually reproducing what the camera does to the data. When I take a real image with a digital camera, I have a lens that blurs the colors, and I have a pixelization, a downsampling into pixels like a local averaging. And so here, this is a variational approach which is aimed at inverting this image formation process. So I'm aiming at getting a color that is actually sharper and higher resolution than the observations. And this is called super resolution in the community. This, to my knowledge, is the first super resolution approach on curved geometric surfaces. So far, super resolution has been done for videos or for planes. You assume the colors are on a plane. Here they live on a surface which changes the position. So here's the idea that this is the object, I'm observing the color, and what I'm observing is a blurred and downsampled version of the true color. Here's what we can compute. So by the way, this energy, what's crucial about it in terms of optimization, it's a convex energy. Why? The data term is quadratic, the regularizer is total variation, it doesn't get simpler than that in terms of energy minimization. And so you see we get very high resolution details here that somehow preclude the fact that the geometry is not very detailed. So it seems like the eye is there and the fur and everything. No, it's not in the reconstruction, it's just in the color. So this is details that are somehow hallucinated by color. But you end up with a color texture model that at least I cannot distinguish visually from the real object. And so for a lot of practical applications, this is good. In fact, here's the comparison to what's the state of the art, is this weighted averaging. I mentioned it tends to blur. Here is the comparison how it works. And I mentioned you are aiming at going beyond the resolution of the input images. Here's the proof that this actually works. This is one of the input images, and they all have the same resolution. They all look like that. This is the super resolution. So you can see we have a lot more detail than in the input images. And you know, anyone who's seen CSI Miami knows this. There's always in each sequence an example where they have a video of the bad guy or his license plate, and then the head of the department says, "Can you zoom in?" And I don't know, the computer nerd hits some button and it zooms in. And it zooms in infinitely and everything is super sharp. I'm sure you've seen that.
And it's using your algorithm, right?
No. In fact, whenever I see these shows, I sit there and think, man, I would like to have that algorithm. I don't know what they have running on their computers. From an image processing point of view, it's amazing. And I'm mean, anyone who works in this field knows this isn't possible. You cannot create information out of nothing. So if it does work at some point, then you start to wonder, why is it possible? Why can we get more out of the image than is actually there?
Multiple images.
Excuse me?
Multiple images.
Exactly. We have multiple images, which they often don't at CSIM. If we had multiple, then I would say, okay, I believe it. But with a single image, we have multiple images, so we basically see the same sharp feature multiple times in a slightly different average image. Because the cameras are independent, and so the grids don't, they don't necessarily coincide.
Have you calculated the relative increase in the resolution compared to the original image?
No. I think there are some theoretical studies that you can do, and I believe you can show that if the more and more images you have, the higher resolution you should be able to get. And I would expect that if you have 5 images, you should be able to increase the resolution by about a factor. Theoretically. That depends on how they are aligned, of course. For example, if the 5 images have exactly the same viewpoint, then they don't help. So there has to be, but generally there's an independency, and then you should expect an increase in resolution. One thing you can do, and this has been done in super resolution for the plane, I said this, this has been tackled many times. And so actually I set one of my students to implement what's there in the literature, just for video super resolution. And so he re-implemented 5 or 6 popular approaches, and then he came back and said none of them worked. He showed me the results, crappy. So I don't know how often that happened to you. Your advisor tells you re-implement this paper, you do it, you come back, and he's not happy, saying, in the paper looks great, and your results are really terrible. Right? And so that happens to all students at some point or other, I guess. So then he came back to me and said, yeah, but I can tell you why the results in the paper look good. What they do often is they simulate experiments. So they take a very sharp, high-resolution image, and then they artificially blur and downsample it. They blur it with a nice Gaussian kernel of a known sigma. They downsample it with a known procedure, and then they can use the exact same procedure in the variational approach or whatever and recover the sharpness. This is useful because then you can quantify your error. You can say, how far am I from the sharp point? The problem is you don't know exactly what a real camera does. It's not just blurring and downsampling. There is noise, and there's all sorts of things that enter the real image formation process. And chances are that 90% of these effects are not part of what you're modeling. And then the question is, does it still work? And so I would always be careful when you look at papers on super resolution. Check, is it real images or are they simulated? And if they're simulated, the question is, how realistic are the simulations?
Can you show in your formula that you also only use the downsampling and the blurring?
Yes.
Why would that be different from what they do in the papers?
That depends on what papers you're talking about. I mean, if you like, we can sit down later and discuss different types of papers. This downsampling, so let's say this variational approach works quite well in our experience. It's at least the best that we found to work. Mathematically, it would be called total variation de-blurring, de-downsampling, if you like, with multiple images. And that was the best in my experience. Partly also because it's a convex energy, so you can compute the globally optimal solution. There's a lot of other strategies in the literature that I don't want to go into detail, and they often work on synthetic images but don't work when you get to real images. Stereo reconstruction is a particular case of multi-view reconstruction, but you saw earlier what we were solving was a binary labeling problem. Yes.
Quick question before we move on. What was the intuition behind, in the previous energy function, there was like a discrete summation from I equals like 1 to n, and then there was an integral. What's the intuition behind that? Just super quick.
The intuition is that you want, the sum here is the sum over all images.
Okay.
And this is the data term that says for all pixels in each image, I want to explain them. So the integral is over the image plane of image I. Omega I is the image, good question. It's the image plane of image I. So I want to explain each pixel of each image. That's the intuition, and then they're all summed over, Stereo reconstruction is a specific case, as I mentioned, but it's not a binary labeling anymore. In practice, stereo, you have two images, let's say, and you want to compute a depth map, where each pixel in the image plane is assigned one of many values. So not just 0, 1, not just object background, but a set of values, say, in some interval from 0, from arbitrary interval. And in optimization, this is called a multi-label optimization problem. So it's not two labels, but multiple labels. And the question is how we can solve these problems. So we are now moving from a binary labeling to a multi-label optimization. And the cost functions that you often have a similar kind of data term and some regularizer here. I use the total variation, but you can use others as well. Typically, the regularizer is often convex, but the data term is in general not convex. The rho would be your photo consistency. It tells you for this disparity, do the colors in the two images match or not? And depending on the colors, some colors match well, others don't. So if you change the disparity U, sometimes you get a good match, sometimes bad. So it's clearly not convex. If you vary U, you get lower or larger images. But it turns out that for this class of energies, you can compute provably optimal solutions. And this is what I will show you, and I should mention what inspired us here is actually a discrete work by Hiroshi Ishikawa, a graph theoretic approach to solving this problem. The idea is that rather than looking for a real valued function u on omega, you rephrase the problem as a binary labeling again of the ambient space. So now you consider omega times the set of labels times gamma, so that's the label space, and on that omega times gamma you have a binary label. 1 below the curve, 0 above the curve, or vice versa, doesn't matter. So the idea is you can rephrase the real valued optimization problem as a binary optimization. Because any function u can be represented as a binary. It's not actually vice versa. Not every binary labeling corresponds to a meaningful function u. So you have to assure basically that there's an ordering, that when you go in gamma direction, that the function b is monotonically decreasing. But that's actually not difficult to do. And this idea, as I said, was inspired by a discrete algorithm of Ishikawa, and we could show in this paper that this extends to a spatially continuous. In fact, this extension mathematically is as follows. We prove that minimizing this energy here, this non-convex energy with respect to u, is equivalent to minimizing this energy here with respect to v. And the nice thing is this is a convex energy. The trade-off, though, is that first of all, we have increased the dimension. We have now, if the image plane is two-dimensional, we now have three dimensions in our problem. So there's more memory and more computation time. And the other problem is we now have a binary labeling, and I was saying the space of binary function is not convex. In this case, it turns out we can drop this binary constraint, relax it, solve over the space of real values labelings, and then threshold the solution, and we prove that in this case, thresholding does not increase the energy. And if thresholding doesn't increase the energy, it means these two energies are actually the same. And that means we have optimality. That means the gap is 0 and we have yes.
How do you know that your binary solution after the thresholding is still feasible? Is there a guarantee?
Yeah. This is guaranteed.
What was the question there? Sorry.
He was asking how we it's still feasible. Feasible, you mean that this ordering, what I call monoptonicity is. So if you have a function that is real valued and monotonous, so strictly decreasing, and then you threshold, it's still strictly decreasing. I don't see a way how that could be done. This constraint is actually not a difficult constraint.
Okay, because this question also holds for the previous case, in which you would
Oh,
use the same extension.
yeah, in that case it's actually difficult, it's not so obvious, yeah. That's a good question. So for the silhouette constraint I mentioned earlier, once you binarize, not any thresholding will assure silhouette consistency. And there,
But you
we
have
show in
guaranteed
the paper, you have to select an appropriate threshold, it always exists, and then you can assure that it's preserved. So for the previous, you're quite right, there it's not obvious, but here it's actually
Yeah.
very obvious. Why the thresholding theorem holds is, I will not go into this for time reasons, it takes about 5 minutes to explain it, but there is a way to prove optimality. The key, maybe to give you an idea, oh, by the way, why these energies are the same, maybe I should give you that intuition. See what we do here, this is the derivative of V with respect to gamma, right? If we go back, I was saying V is actually 0, 1. So the derivative in gamma direction is 0, except if gamma is U of x. That's where it jumps from 1 to 0 in a way that this derivative is non-zero exactly at gamma equals U of x. And so it's actually, this expression dV by d gamma is nothing but the delta function of gamma minus U of x. And then if you integrate over gamma, it assures that gamma equals U of x. And so what you get here is rho of x and U of x, the exact same integration. So that's the way you can easily see that these two expressions are really the same. And similarly, you can show that the total variation of U is the same as the total variation of these V's over all gammas. This is in geometric measure theory. This latter equality is called the co-area formula. And so here's an application. So that means we can compute provably optimal solutions for stereo reconstruction. And this is one of the benchmarks with a simple brightness constancy data term. This is the reconstruction we get. And you see we can initialize with a constant and just minimize this convex energy. Here's a more real-world image taken from an airplane, one of 2 images, and this is the depth reconstruction. Again, a very simple brightness constancy data term. And so what you see here is we can preserve a lot of fine scale details, the roof shapes, the chimney, the lantern post, everything is there. And you can imagine, in the context of, say, Google Earth or other projects, this is actually quite useful to be able to reconstruct the world from aerial images. Here's a 3D visualization which I generated just to give you a better idea of what this looks like.
Talking about benchmarking, how long does it take to combine or to optimize those images?
This is an issue I mentioned. The sacrifice we pay is we have to increase the dimension. So rather than having a 2D problem, we have a 3D problem. So the computation times go up. On this Middlebury benchmark, I think it took about a minute to compute.
On a regular workstation.
But it scales linearly with the number of voxels. So if you double the image resolution, you double the computation time. If you want twice as many labels, so twice as many disparity values, you have to invest twice as much time. So it's not the fastest algorithm. There exist faster algorithms, so depending on what you do, this may not be the right choice. But here we were more interested in saying, given the cost function, this entire class of possible energies, can we compute the provable optimum? And indeed we can. The question is then whether the cost function is the right one, whether the data terms are what you want, but this is a separate. Segmentation is a particular case of multi-labeling, much like stereo, the difference is that the regularity terms are not convex. And what I mentioned, the thresholding theorem that proves optimality for stereo, it only holds if the regularizers are convex. So the total variation, for example, that I had earlier, this is convex. Segmentation is a case where this a similar multi-label problem, but not convex. Mathematically, this is what it looks like. It's often called the minimal partition problem in the literature. The idea is you want to partition the image plane and you want to assign one of many labels, and each label corresponds to a region. Region 0, 1, 2, 3. Then you have a data term that typically aggregates the local color information. So Fi of x tells you how much does a pixel x like to belong to region I or region J. And so depending on what Fi is for the different regions, each pixel has a certain preference. I would like to go to region 2, the other one says I would like to go to region 3. And of course, that term in itself is easy to solve. You just ask each pixel where do you want to go, and you assign that label. What makes it difficult, and in fact NP-hard, is a regularizer which says that neighboring pixels should favor the same label. So you want to impose some kind of democracy, where neighboring pixels agree on what label they should select. And if they don't agree, if one neighbor has a different label, one pixel has a different label than its neighbor, it costs something. But what's key about this so-called POTS model is that the cost is independent of how much the label changes. And that means I'm actually just penalizing the transitions between these different regions. So I'm penalizing the boundary lengths between the different. And this class of energies is the kind of paradigm in partitioning or segmentation problems. A data term and some regularity term that penalizes boundary. So, for example, the classical snakes are of this type, the Mumford-Cha functional is of this type, and a lot of others also. And it's difficult because the regularizer is non-convex in the sense that if I have a transition between labels, I pay independent of how much the transition is. Not like in total variation, where the penalty grows with the label jump. We can rephrase this into a convex problem again by indicator functions. So we have a binary labeling for the region omega I. We call it di, and then this energy looks like that. The d is the gradient. It's the distributional derivative, but you can think of it as the gradient. So this is again the total variation of vi. This is the boundary length actually. Again, it measures the number of jumps. And then vi times fi is the same as integral of fi over omega I, because vi is one only inside omega I. And so that masks out the entire rest of it. This is a difficult problem. One can rewrite it in a so-called primal dual form, and then we have a dual variable, a set of dual variables that is constrained in this manner, where this constraint basically imposes that the transition from label J to label I should be penalized by 1 and not 3 moments. I'll go a little faster. So maybe I'll skip the segmentation stuff. So this is all applications of segmentation, functional relaxations. And come maybe to the last part, which is a little more intuitive again, shape matching. Let's say you have two 3D shapes and you want to compare the similarity of these shapes. Once you look at shape similarity, you find that human notions of similarity are tightly coupled with correspondence. So you want to find a correspondence between the two shapes. And the question is how you can do that. So the goal is to compute shape similarity. The way we do it is we want to find a correspondence such that I can deform one shape into the other without too much effort. This is the key idea. Here's how we do it in practice. We discretize the two shapes with a triangulation on each shape. And then we assign a binary labeling to each pair of triangles. So we want want to know, is this triangle, does it match to that triangle on the other shape? And if it matches, we give it a 1, the binary variable. If it doesn't match, we give it a 0. And so the goal is to determine for each triangle on this shape, what is the corresponding triangle on the other shape. Now, if you just go at it like that, it's never going to work, because in general, there's not the same number of triangles on the two shapes. So you cannot expect each triangle here to have a partner. First of all, maybe a different number, but secondly, the ear itself, even if the total number of triangles is the same, since the ears are bigger here, there's more triangles here than there. And so what we do to account for that, to allow for stretching and shrinking, is we allow triangles on one shape to match two edges on the other shape. So we allow collapsing of triangles. Of course, we want to penalize that. We don't want arbitrary collapsing. So we have some cost that is assigned to a matching of these that penalizes shrinking and stretching. We have another binary variable for each pair of triangle and edge. And now if you extrapolate and you think, wait a second, how many triangles are there? There's a few thousand triangles on this shape, a few thousand on that shape. So the total number of pairs of triangles is easily millions. So it's from an optimization point of view, a very large scale. Nevertheless, we can try to tackle it. We have an integer variable for each basic correspondence. We have an assignment cost. I mentioned that if there's shrinking or stretching, we pay. We just look at the area change. And we also have a bending cost, where we say the curvatures at these 2 points of the shape should be the same. If they're not, then we pay, because then there's some bending. And this is all aggregated in a local assignment cost, and then the goal is to determine the best correspondence by solving this integer linear program, where we have for each triangle pair, if they are matched, we pay the cost. If they're not matched, we don't. So we have a simple linear program over a set of a lot of binary variables. And then we have constraints. These constraints are essentially the first constraint, del gaunt x equals 0, says that what it basically says is that neighboring elements are matching to neighboring elements. We want to preserve a continuity, a geometric consistency. So if two triangles match, then the neighbor triangle must match to something in the vicinity. And we want to explain all triangles. This is the other two conditions. Projection on the first shape of x is 1 basically means each triangle in the first shape has some partner in the other shape, and vice versa. Everything has to be accounted for, and so this is the formulation. Unfortunately, this is NP-hard, but we can again relax and find approximate solutions, very much like I mentioned earlier. So by relaxation, we can find a solution, and this is the solution. Basically, what we show here is a morphing that morphs one shape into the other along the correspondence we compute. And that gives you an idea of how plausible the matching is. You can see how the ears grow and shrink, how the mouth grows, etc. So it's mimic evolution. Here's another example. In practice, we can handle up to 6,500 triangles on each shape, and so we can hallucinate a lot of intermediate shapes in this way. Given 2 3D shapes, we can measure their similarity, because the elastic cost, the overall cost that we end up after minimizing, this can be used as a distance between the two shapes. It measures the similarity. So to conclude, I showed that a lot of image analysis and computer vision problems can be expressed in terms of convex energies. I didn't mention, but we also looked into algorithms, and we've developed very fast polynomial time or fast algorithms to solve these problems efficiently, primal dual algorithms. The difficulty, maybe to say one more word about optimization, is from an optimization point of view, these problems are typically not differentiable. For example, the total variation is not differentiable, so you have convex but non-smooth optimization problems to solve. And with primal dual algorithms, we can probably find optimal solutions. And in practice, these solutions are independent of initialization, which means I no longer need the user in the loop, and they are either optimal, as in the stereo case, for example, or they are within some bound of the optimal. And so I believe by convexifying variational or optimization problems, we can actually drastically improve the practical performance of these models. Thank you.
We've run a little bit over time, so if you need to leave, feel free, but otherwise questions for Professor Cremers.
We've already had a lot of questions.
About the last visualization of the unity of the house, have a meaning?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. What they are is Voronoi oscillations. Now, they don't look like Voronoi oscillations, but they are Voronoi oscillations in the practice. And so what they need in practice is